About 10 years ago, we saw an uptick in marriage, but that was fairly short-lived. Rates are right now plunging again, down to half what they were of the peak in 1972. So is this a sign of a more liberated society? We're delighted to have the New Statesman writer Louise Perry writing for us in The Spectator about this phenomenon. She has a book now out called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Louise, great to have you with us. Why do you think that the marriage rates are going down? Isn't this a sign of social progress?
So the crucial piece of legislation here is the Divorce Reform Act in 1969, which was one of the sort of the great pieces of liberalising legislation in the period of the beginning of the sexual revolution. What's really interesting, when I was writing the book, actually, I went back and I read Hansard and I read the debates around that piece of legislation, and the view at the time was that this was just a very minor piece of liberalisation that would just make life a little bit easier for people who were in desperately unhappy marriages and needed to be out of them. This is, of course, at the time when it was really hard to get a divorce, and you had to prove adultery, intolerable cruelty, etc. And so the view from all of the revolutionaries, they didn't know they were revolutionaries at the time, was that you just a little tweak and it would make things just that little bit simpler, that little bit kinder to people who were desperate to get divorced. Of course, that's not what happened at all. What happens immediately, you look at the graph of divorce rates in the UK, and 1969 is just this explosion, and you see divorce climbs and climbs. It peaks in the 1970s, and then it's kind of levelled off or just bounced around a little bit since then. But that's not because marriages are becoming longer, it's because people are not getting married in the first place. And what seems to have happened is that as soon as you sort of reach this threshold where it was no longer assumed that you would be married for life, you end up with this kind of acceleration effect where previously you would only consider a divorce if your marriage was desperately unhappy, and then the threshold became a little bit lower and a little bit lower and a little bit lower, and now we're at the stage where about half of children are not born in wedlock, which is historically unprecedented. And clearly there have been beneficiaries of that. I completely acknowledge that there are some marriages that are miserable and abusive and desperately need to end, and people should be able to end those marriages. But I'm not convinced by the idea that this has been liberation for everyone. I particularly think that children have suffered as a consequence of this, and I think poor women in particular have suffered as well, because what we know from the data is that the best environment for a stable and prosperous family in which to raise children is a married couple who stay married.
But is that necessarily, does data show that marriage is better than two people cohabiting? Because what you get is quite a lot in Britain, and to take Sweden for example, my wife is Swedish. When I proposed to her, her friends were kind of shocked that she wasn't even pregnant. In Sweden, the way things work out there is you have a baby. If things go well, then you might have another baby. If things go well, you might then get married. But it doesn't. It's difficult to say that the Swedish society is any sort of worse than British, because they've got a cohabiting tradition. So is cohabitation demonstrably worse than marriage for the child?
I don't know the situation in Sweden. I wonder if common law marriage is recognised in law there, because that does change things. One of the things that a lot of people don't realise here is that you have no rights unless you are married formally to someone. So there are all sorts of negative consequences if someone dies or you split and you're not formally married, in terms of things like inheritance tax and other rights that married couples.
But you have civil partnerships here. The Blair government introduced this sort of marriage light at the time.
But then, interestingly, that just seems to have been. It is in technical terms basically the same as being married, just without the religious aspect.
It gives you all of the legal entitlements, doesn't it? If people don't want to get married but still want the legal protection of inheritance and whatnot. But that's been a flop, has it?
Well, it doesn't seem to have had the uptake that one might have expected. People are just choosing to cohabit. And the problem with cohabitation longer term, and in thinking about children and so on, is couples who are cohabiting are much more likely to split, because there seems to be when it is just that little bit more difficult to, every relationship across a lifetime, life is very long. You will go through periods of not liking each other as much. And it seems that when it's hard to divorce, people tend to stick with it and are more likely to push through the tough times and get to a happier stage where they, are pleased to still be together. But if divorce is easy, or if just splitting because you're not even married in the first place is easy, we see in the data that people are much more likely to do it, and actually likely to regret it. I was really surprised to read data on the proportion of divorced people who regret getting divorced. In this country, it's between about a third and a half.
Really?
Yeah, I know, it's really high.
Some of our listeners might find it strange, this argument coming from you, a New Statesman writer. I mean, typically, the right have been the one talking about family values and trying to resist divorce reform, and the left have been the one arguing for more liberal structures. Do you think the left have miscalculated here, that marriage is a progressive force?
I mean, if you look at the data, the class skew on marriage is absolutely incredible. In this country, also in the States and in other places, you get a liberal elite who tend to talk negatively about marriage and are opposed to marriage incentives in policy making and so forth. But they are actually the group of people who are most likely to themselves get married and stay married. So there's a kind of, if you've heard the expression luxury belief, Rob Henderson's idea of an idea which confers status on rich people and harms poor people. The anti-marriage sexual revolution idea is a really great example of a luxury belief, because it's deeply unfashionable on the left to talk about marriage being a force for good, but actually people in elite positions, people who are wealthier upper middle classes, for themselves love marriage and are the group most likely to choose it for themselves and wish it for their children and so on. They're just reluctant to prescribe it for the rest of society, which actually disproportionately harms poorer people.
Right. So do you think in this case that the progressive cause should be to promote marriage? I mean, it seems unlikely, but I don't know, but from what you're saying, if the figures show, as you suggest, that marriage, first of all, is a tool that benefits people, that the rich tend to get married a lot even though they advocate liberalism, and that people in poorer communities are suffering for the lack of it. Is this a cause which the left ought to take up? I mean, what can you do to promote marriage? It sounds a bit hectoring, doesn't it, for any politician to be suggesting to somebody else how they should or shouldn't live their lives?
As I say, deeply, deeply unfashionable. But I think that if we're thinking about children in particular, and if we're concerned about the various adverse outcomes that come for children of not growing up in a house with their fathers at home, talking about things like higher incarceration rates for boys, higher teen pregnancy rates for girls, poorer mental health for both sexes in all sorts of ways. We know that there is this institution, now mostly dead, which can improve all of those outcomes. And actually, there are all sorts of ways in this country that marriage is actually disincentivized by the state. For instance, we don't assess people's tax on the basis of a family. It is there's very few advantages from being married in terms of your tax arrangements, because you still have to pay tax on an individual basis, which means that a single earner household actually ends up paying a lot more tax than a dual earner household, which has been deliberately designed by the new Labour government. That's the sort of policy that would be quite easy to change and would provide just that little bit of incentive for people to choose to get married and choose to stay married, with all of the benefits that brings in terms of both for individuals and also for families.
If this isn't really creeping through in policy, I wonder if it's creeping through in popular culture. Let's take, for example, Beyoncé, a great feminist icon. Now, she argued about, quite a few years ago now, that women should be insisting upon marriage. If you like it, she said, you should put a ring on it. Do you think this will be a feminist cri de coeur now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, where Beyoncé goes, I suppose we all follow. But I think it ought to be. And I think what's really interesting, and I write about this in the piece at the end, is that a lot of feminists or progressives who rail against marriage because it's associated with a religious right and all of this, it's old-fashioned, it's terrible, find ways of kind of reinventing marriage. Because actually the like central idea of having some sort of formal legal bond to the person with whom you're in a sexual relationship with, and even more so with whom you have a child with, there's actually a great deal of wisdom to that. There's a reason that it has persisted down the ages. And so you have various sort of proposals which sound actually an awful lot like marriage, but just don't have that term. I think.
Yeah, I was fascinated in your article that you mentioned something called radical monogamy, a phrase I hadn't come across before, but is mentioned by Vice magazine recently. What is radical monogamy, and is it just another word for marriage?
Yeah, radical monogamy apparently is when you deliberately choose to be monogamous, having sort of properly assessed all of the other options, rather than just being monogamous by default, because that's what the culture tells you ought to do. I do not see any meaningful difference between those two things. The outcome is exactly the same. And it's a good one, you know. We know, I mean, on the subject of polyamory, so that's what's been presented as the alternative to monogamy, right? And there are various pushes to formalise polyamory and permit multiple marriages and so on. I don't know if they're going to go anywhere. One of the things I write about in the book is that monogamous marriage is not only good for individuals, good for children, it also has effects on the whole of a society, which are really remarkable. Societies where monogamous marriage is formalised in law tend to be more prosperous. They tend to have lower rates of violence. They tend to have lower rates of domestic abuse and child abuse. There are all sorts of ways that, you know, because all of this is networked, right? Like, kind of the point I'm trying to make in the book is this isn't just about individual choice. This isn't just about individual freedom. This is thinking about the well-being of society as a whole. And monogamous marriage turned out historically to be this amazing tool for promoting a flourishing society.